Okay, in this tutorial we'll talk about how to configure a website that has an entity project reference. So in addition to configuring our site for NBusiness, we'll also, for this example, configure our site for accessing a SQL Server database and using the default ASP.NET role provider and membership providers. So well, first thing we'll do is open up the web.config file here and add a config section. We'll do this by adding the config sections element here. It's important to note that that actually needs to be at the top of the config file. It can't be in the body somewhere. Most of these other things can be wherever you want them, but this one specifically needs to be at the top of the configuration elements. So in this case we're going to name it. You can call this whatever you want. Actually, I think you need to call it NBusiness specifically. Sorry. So NBusiness.data.settings is the class, and there we have set up our NBusiness config section. And so next thing we'll do is actually define this config section down here. We'll call it NBusiness. And NBusiness has three properties, or four properties actually, three of which we'll be setting here. One is connection string name, which we can call whatever we want. We'll call it my site. Another one is authorize default equals true. It's false by default, but we're going to call it true. Access default equals true. And so what we're doing here actually is telling NBusiness to allow authorization rules and access rules to succeed by default as opposed to fail. So by default everything fails if you don't explicitly set rules to allow people to perform actions such as reading properties or inserting rows into the database. They will fail. But in this case, we're setting this to succeed so that it makes it a little bit less work to get started. Now that we've had NBusiness configured, one thing we're missing here is our connection string. So what we need to do is create a connection string. We're going to go with a pretty simple one for this example. We're going to say data source equals dot so catalog equals my site A typical scheme to use here is to have multiple connection strings where they have the same name, and then to simply comment in or out the one that's appropriate for the environment that the server will be running. So for example, you might have one called debug and one called production, and then before you move your application or deploy your application, you might comment out your debug configuration string and comment your production string. And the reason why we do this is because some of the other providers have the same model. The ASP.NET Role Provider Membership model also receive a connection string name to know which connection string to use. And so that's what we'll go ahead and hook up here next. For this example, we're going to change this to forms, and then we're going to go ahead and add some sections here, which I'll spare you and won't type out manually. I have a few things prepared here. So we're going to hook up the role manager. And so all we're doing here is saying which provider to use for the role manager, which is the default ASP.NET SQL role provider. And it's going to use the same connection string. This is the name application. This is the type that it's associated with. We're also going to use the default membership provider. And it's basically the exact same thing. There's a lot of other options here you can use. Or I shouldn't say it's the same thing, they're very different, but it's basically the same type of settings that we're entering here. There's a lot of other options here. Feel free to come in and modify them as you, actually this one doesn't have anymore, but this one I believe does. Or maybe not. There are more options. IntelliSense it just isn't picking it up. But there are more options here, and you can configure all those things. Okay, and then there's one other thing we want to do here, and that is to add the NBusiness controls here. I'm going to also spare you the typing. Okay, so what we're going to do here is add controls with the tag prefix of NB to all of these pages here so that we can access the entity data source and whatnot. And those are all found in the namespace nbusiness.data.web. Okay, so now that's all we need to do. The next step for us is to configure our database.